Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Corinthians. We're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 12. We're examining Paul's teaching on the spiritual gifts. Now we're looking particularly at 1 Corinthians 12 verses 8 and following, in which Paul gives the listing of the gifts of the Spirit he wants to talk about. And yesterday we looked at the first two gifts he mentioned, which are the gift of wisdom and the gift of knowledge. Today we're looking at the third gifts he mentions in this list, and we find that in 1 Corinthians 12, verse 9. To another, he gives faith by the same Spirit, the gift of faith. Now, when we read this, our immediate question is, well, how is this a gift of the Spirit? Because all Christians have faith, right? The very Christian life itself is based on faith. We're saved by grace through faith. Everything we receive from God, we receive through faith. So faith is the operating level of all Christians. So how do we distinguish a special spiritual gift called faith? Well, let's pause for a moment here and understand that there's an overlap between just the normal Christian life that all Christians live, gifted by God and His grace, and the spiritual gifts, which are extraordinary heavenly endowments. So, for example, yesterday we looked at the gifts of wisdom and of knowledge. Now, obviously, all Christians seek to be wise and walk in spiritual wisdom. Obviously, all Christians seek to have knowledge, biblical knowledge, spiritual knowledge, and walk in that knowledge. So, wisdom and knowledge are something all Christians should walk in by the power of the Holy Spirit. But there is a special, extraordinary measure of the gift of wisdom that is beyond the normal practice of wisdom. There's a special gifting of a word of knowledge that is beyond just our regular knowledge. So, in many ways, the gifts of the Spirit overlap with regular Christian life, but they are a measure beyond, as it were. And so it is with faith. So it is with faith. All Christians live by faith. We're always attempting to grow deeper and deeper in our faith. But there are those moments when God gives the gift of what I'm going to call an extraordinary level of faith, an extraordinary, heavenly endowed ability to trust God and to believe in God. Let me give you a couple of examples, biblical examples. Do you remember the time when Jesus came to the disciples? They were on the Sea of Galilee. He came to them walking upon the water. Of course, they were standing. First, they were terribly afraid. And Jesus says, it's me. And Peter, the Apostle Peter said, Lord, if it's really you, let me walk to you on the water. And Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water to him. Now, he was walking by faith, but I believe that at this point, this is probably an example of that spiritual gift of faith. It took an extraordinary amount of faith for Peter to be able to walk on the water. I believe this is probably an example of what we mean by the spiritual gift of faith. It's similar and of the same kind, really, of all kinds of Christian faith. But there are times when God gives an extraordinarily deep ability to believe in Him, and that is the spiritual gift of faith. A couple of centuries ago, there lived a man in England by the name of George Mueller, great Christian evangelist, and his greatest ministry was the founding of orphanages all across England. And George Mueller was convinced that he should never ask for funds. He should never ask people to support his ministry. He just believed God would always supply the needs of the orphans he was caring for, and God always did. Now that took an extraordinary amount of faith. All Christians are people of faith, but sometimes there are those gifted with an extraordinary level, the ability to trust in God. I believe George Mueller had that spiritual gift of faith, an extraordinary, heavenly endowed ability to trust God. And so he never issued fundraising appeals for the orphans he cared for, just believing, trusting, having faith that God would supply all of his needs. And He did. So all of the gifts are that way. In one sense, we all operate in all the things the gifts talk about, but there are moments when God gives that extraordinary ability, an extraordinary wisdom, a gift of wisdom, an extraordinary knowledge that we could not have on our own, the gift of knowledge, and extraordinary faith, heavenly sent ability to trust in God. That is the gift of faith. Now, certainly that's the gift we should all strive for. We would love to have. We want to believe and believe more deeply, and God endow me with that gift of faith. So we're very moved as Paul talks about the third of the spiritual gifts, the gift of faith, that extraordinarily deep ability to trust in God to provide all of our needs. Join us again tomorrow as we continue looking at the gifts one by one in our 5-minute Bible study in the book of 1 Corinthians.